April 28, 1941, Newport News Shipbuilding, Virginia. The first steel plates of the USS Essex were laid down, marking the beginning of a new era in naval warfare. The ship would become the cornerstone of an entire class of aircraft carriers that would go on to change the face of the Pacific War. In the shipyards of Newport News, workers were assembling what would soon be known as the Essex-class carriers, a series of vessels that would dominate the seas. The Essex herself, hull number CV-9, measured 872 feet in length and displaced 27,100 tons at standard capacity, with a flight deck capable of launching 90 to 100 aircraft. What no one in the shipyard knew at the time was that this one ship's design would ignite an unprecedented carrier production campaign, one that would eventually define the course of the war in the Pacific. The lessons learned in the early years of World War II had made it clear to American planners that aircraft carriers were more than just powerful warships. They were the key to naval supremacy. By cutting off an enemy's supply lines and air support, entire fleets could be rendered vulnerable. And with it, the entire strategic balance could be shifted. At the time, the Imperial Japanese Navy had established a formidable force of 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, which had been instrumental in the success of the Pearl Harbor attack and the subsequent projection of Japanese power across the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval doctrine, had positioned carrier-based aviation as the decisive force in modern naval warfare. Ironically, it was American ingenuity and industrial capacity that would soon prove this belief true, though in a way Yamamoto had never anticipated. On her shakedown cruise, the USS Essex cut through the Atlantic at a speed of 32.7 knots, powered by Westinghouse turbines generating an impressive 150,000 shaft horsepower. Captain Donald Duncan stood on the bridge, studying the flight operations as the ship prepared for her future role in the war. Her air wing consisted of 36 F-6F Hellcats, 36 SB-2C Helldivers, and 18 TBF Avengers, a potent mix of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers that would serve as the backbone of her offensive capabilities. The design and construction of the Essex was a testament to American industrial might. The shipyards had prioritized the Essex-class carriers, understanding that they were the future of naval combat. While Japanese carriers were often customized and modified based on their individual needs, the Essex-class carriers relied on standardized blueprints which allowed for mass production. This industrial efficiency gave the U.S. Navy an edge that Japan's shipbuilding efforts could not match. The production timeline for Japanese carriers was excruciatingly slow, with each ship taking 4 to 5 years to complete. In contrast, the Essex-class carriers took, on average, only 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. The speed of American production would prove to be one of the deciding factors in the Pacific conflict.
Commander David McCampbell, a Princeton-educated aviator with a keen understanding of naval tactics, knew that carrier warfare was more than just about aircraft. It was about the ability to sustain sorties and replace pilots. McCampbell's insight was simple yet profound. Victory in the air would depend on industrial output, not just combat tactics. The ability to maintain pilot numbers and provide consistent sorties could be the difference between victory and defeat. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, Captain Hiroshi Matsubara of the Shokaku observed his dwindling air strength. His carrier, which displaced 25,675 tons, had only 72 operational aircraft and had been operating under constant pressure from American forces. Japan had attempted to build new carriers of the Unryu class based on the older Hiryu design to accelerate production, but these carriers were often incomplete or lacked trained air crews. Even when completed, the Japanese carriers faced the critical issue of pilot attrition, a problem that would soon be impossible to overcome given America's industrial capacity to replace pilots and aircraft at a far higher rate. As American shipyards worked at full capacity, the scale of their effort was unparalleled. The Newport News shipbuilding alone would eventually be tasked with building 7 carriers, while Bethlehem Steel's Fore River shipyard took on 4. Other major yards, such as Philadelphia, Norfolk, and New York, all contributed to the mass production effort. Each facility was tasked with specialized phases of the construction process, yet all adhered to standardized designs to ensure consistency and efficiency. The results were staggering. Within a mere 371 days of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the USS Yorktown, CV-10, was launched on December 21, 1942. By April 26, 1943, the USS Intrepid, CV-11, had entered the water, followed by the USS Hornet, CV-12, on August 30, 1943. These ships would go on to play pivotal roles in some of the most crucial battles of the war, including the Battle of Midway and the Mariana Islands campaign. As the war continued, these carriers became the backbone of American naval power, proving that in the modern era, it was not the size of the fleet, but its ability to project air power at sea that determined victory. On October 14, 1943, the USS Franklin, CV-13, was launched into service, marking another milestone in the United States' rapidly expanding naval capabilities. As American shipyards worked at full capacity, the scale of their effort was unparalleled. As men worked tirelessly to support this massive production effort was first-class radar operator James Patterson. Stationed aboard the USS Bunker Hill, Patterson's job was to monitor the ship's SK air search radar, which was capable of detecting aircraft at distances over 100 miles under ideal conditions. Patterson's radar system was a vital part of a far superior American detection network. By contrast, Japan's radar technology, while useful, provided far less reliable early warning. On June 19, 1944, at 14:35, Patterson's radar lit up with multiple contacts. The range was 150 miles, and the bearing was 260 degrees. A massive wave of aircraft was on approach, an estimated 69 enemy planes in the first group. Without hesitation, Patterson pressed the alarm button and grabbed the sound-powered telephone to relay the message. Combat Information Center, radar large raid, bearing 260, range 150 miles, altitude unknown, closing in. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, was committing its entire carrier force to Operation Eigo, a last-ditch attempt to turn the tide in the Pacific. This was Japan's final opportunity to achieve the victory that had eluded them 2 years earlier at Midway. Ozawa's force consisted of 9 aircraft carriers, including the Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, Hiyo, Ryuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuho, which collectively carried 440 aircraft, Japan's last concentrated naval aviation strength. On the American side, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet, had already begun preparations for the incoming Japanese threat. Stationed aboard his flagship, the USS Indianapolis, Spruance had 95 aircraft from 15 different carriers, including 6 of the newly built Essex-class carriers. The first interception came at 1500 hours. The F-6F Hellcats of the U.S. Navy, already airborne and patrolling the skies, took immediate action, diving into the Japanese formation with devastating results. The Hellcats, equipped with 6.5 caliber machine guns and capable of firing 2,000 rounds per minute, tore through the Japanese planes with ease. Their armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition quickly overwhelmed the enemy aircraft, while the Zeros, once the pride of the Japanese air fleet, were left at a disadvantage. Lieutenant Alexander Vatsu, in one of the Hellcats, shot down 6 Japanese planes in just 8 minutes. The Hellcat's superior speed and ability to climb rapidly gave it a distinct advantage in the fight. As Vatsu climbed above the enemy formation and dove down through them with guns blazing, the geometry of aerial combat became a simple equation of height, speed, and firepower. The American pilots, many with extensive combat experience of 500 to 1,000 hours, outmatched their Japanese counterparts, who often had fewer than 100 hours of flight training. A second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived at 1530, consisting of 128 planes. This group met a wall of American fighter opposition, along with heavy anti-aircraft fire from the fleet below. The result was catastrophic. American fighters and anti-aircraft artillery took down nearly 480 Japanese aircraft during the course of the day, with 346 of those being from the carrier force alone. This incredible loss for the Japanese became known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, due to the one-sided nature of the slaughter. By the end of the day on June 19, 1944, Ozawa had lost 346 aircraft from his carriers and another 50 from land-based units. On the American side, losses were far lighter, totaling just 30 aircraft. The imbalance between the two forces was clear. The training pipelines for Japanese pilots, already under strain, required 18 months to produce a single, marginally qualified carrier aviator. Meanwhile, American programs could churn out fully trained pilots every 6 months, in numbers that far exceeded Japan's total production of aviators. The strategic gap in air superiority had reached a breaking point. But the true story of American naval superiority had only just begun. The new Essex-class carriers demonstrated a remarkable ability to dominate the skies and the seas. These carriers, designed with vast, highly efficient flight decks and state-of-the-art radar systems, could launch and recover aircraft with unparalleled speed and precision. This made them not only effective in traditional strike missions, but also highly versatile for defensive and offensive operations across the Pacific. On June 20, 1944, Admiral Mark Mitcher made a daring decision to launch an extended-range attack against the retreating Japanese fleet. As the aircraft took off in the late afternoon, they pushed the limits of their fuel capacities, venturing far beyond the usual operational range. The strike resulted in significant damage to the Japanese fleet. The carrier Hayo was sunk. Zukaku and Syoda were badly damaged, and 65 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. However, the return journey was fraught with peril. The American planes faced the challenges of darkness and dwindling fuel reserves. In a moment of boldness, Mitcher issued an order that would become legendary in naval warfare: turn on the lights. Despite the risks posed by enemy submarines, every ship in Task Force 58 illuminated their decks, offering crucial visual beacons for the returning pilots. This extraordinary act of confidence demonstrated the belief the Americans had in their technological and tactical superiority. Although 80 aircraft were lost to fuel exhaustion, most pilots were successfully rescued, marking a significant blow to the Japanese fleet. In total, Japan lost 2 more carriers and a significant number of trained aircrew.
The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which took place from June 19th to 20th, was more than just a tactical victory. It underscored the overwhelming industrial strength of the United States and the impossibility of Japan's military success in the face of American production capacity. For the Japanese Navy, the hope for victory rested on the concept of a decisive battle, a final confrontation where the American fleet could be drawn close to Japanese shores and destroyed. But this strategy was already obsolete by 1944. The United States had implemented a production system that rendered Japan's hopes of victory irrelevant. By mid-1944, 14 Essex-class carriers were operational in the Pacific theater. These ships included USS Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hancock, Bennington, Boxer, and Bonhomme Richard. Each of these carriers could carry between 90 to 100 aircraft, with later air groups including night fighters to bolster offensive capabilities. This gave the U.S. Navy an air strength of over 1,400 first-line aircraft, backed by a well-trained pool of replacement pilots ready to fill any empty cockpit. In stark contrast, Japan had only completed one new fleet carrier since the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Taiho, commissioned on March 7, 1944. However, she lasted just 3 months before being sunk by the USS Albacore submarine. Another carrier, the Shinano, built on the hull of the Yamato battleship, was commissioned on November 19, 1944. Tragically, she was sunk only 10 days later, on November 29, 1944, after being struck by 4 torpedoes from the USS Archerfish, becoming the largest ship ever sunk by a submarine. The disparity in carrier production between the two nations was evident. While American shipyards were able to churn out an Essex-class carrier every 2 months, Japanese yards required more than 4 years to produce just one fleet carrier. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. By October 1944, Japan's industrial production had reached its limits, and its remaining carriers were pressed into service as decoys. This culminated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle of World War II, which began on October 23, 1944. On October 24th, 17 American carriers launched continuous strikes on the Japanese fleet, beginning with Admiral Kurita's center force, which included the super battleships Yamato and Musashi. These vessels faced relentless air assaults, with the Musashi absorbing 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes before sinking, a testament to the overwhelming firepower that American Essex-class carriers could deliver. Meanwhile, Admiral Ozawa's northern decoy force, consisting of the carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chisote, and Chiyoda, had only 116 aircraft between them, many of which were flown by inexperienced pilots with fewer than 50 flight hours. The U.S. carriers launched 527 sorties against this understrength force on October 25th, sinking all 4 of the Japanese carriers, including Zuikaku, the last of the carriers that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. With this, the American Third Fleet, commanded by Admiral William Halsey, had grown to 17 fast carriers centered around the Essex-class ships. This massive fleet could launch strikes every 90 minutes, sustaining continuous operations without exhaustion, an advantage Japan could not match. By this point, the remnants of the Japanese Air Force were reduced to desperate kamikaze attacks flown by undertrained pilots on one-way missions.
The survivability of the Essex-class carriers. The USS Franklin provided a stark demonstration of the Essex-class carrier's resilience. On March 19, 1945, 2 armor-piercing bombs struck the Franklin, detonating in her hangar and setting off a series of catastrophic explosions. Fires raged across the ship, resulting in 724 dead and 265 wounded, the highest casualty toll ever suffered by an American aircraft carrier. Despite this, the Franklin remained afloat and was able to return to the U.S. under her own power. Had the war continued, the carrier could have been repaired and returned to service. In stark contrast, Japanese carriers such as the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, which were destroyed at the Battle of Midway, were far less durable. These ships were sunk by relatively minor damage that the Essex-class carriers regularly survived. The ability of the Essex-class to endure and continue operations even under extreme conditions highlighted the profound difference in ship survivability between the two navies. The changing nature of naval warfare. The American victory in the Pacific was not just a matter of superior tactics, but also a result of industrial might and technological advancements. The Essex-class carriers, built with heavy armor and advanced firefighting systems, proved to be nearly impervious to the damage that had decimated the Japanese carriers. In contrast, Japan's inability to keep pace with American production and technological innovation made their hopes of achieving victory increasingly unrealistic.
The Japanese military had long placed its faith in the idea of a decisive, single battle that would cripple the American fleet and turn the tide of the war. But as the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the ongoing dominance of American carriers demonstrated, such a strategy was doomed to failure. In the end, it was not a single battle, but the overwhelming industrial and technological capacity of the United States that proved insurmountable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, and the survival of ships like the USS Franklin revealed the crucial advantage that the United States had gained. Not only the number of ships, but their ability to endure. This industrial superiority ultimately made Japanese resistance a futile endeavor, proving that the decisive factor in the war was not just military tactics, but the unmatched ability of the American war machine to replenish its forces and sustain its operations across vast distances.
As Japan's fleet dwindled and its trained pilots were decimated, it became clear that the war had already been decided long before the final shots were fired. The American industrial engine, embodied in the Essex-class carriers and the pilots who manned them, had rendered Japan's naval power obsolete. The contrasting philosophies behind American and Japanese naval designs during World War II reveal a sharp divergence in strategic priorities. In the United States, shipbuilding focused on survivability and damage control, ensuring that even after suffering substantial hits, a ship could remain operational and continue to contribute to the fight. American carriers were engineered with extensive damage control systems, superior radar, and robust anti-aircraft defenses. They were built to absorb hits that would otherwise send enemy ships to the bottom of the sea. On the other hand, Japanese aircraft carriers were designed with a primary focus on offensive capability rather than defensive resilience. This fundamental difference in ship design became a crucial factor in the eventual American dominance at sea. Commander John Thatch, who developed the defensive tactics for American carriers, meticulously studied the growing superiority of U.S. carriers. He concluded that each new class of American carrier added significant combat power not only through larger air groups and enhanced radar, but also through damage control systems that allowed them to survive heavy punishment and keep fighting. The production statistics underline the vast disparity between the two nations' industrial capabilities. Over the course of the war, the United States commissioned 32 Essex-class aircraft carriers, 26 of which were laid down and 24 completed. Japan, by contrast, managed to commission fewer than 12 fleet carriers in the same period, spread across 2 decades, with notable vessels including Hoso, Akagi, Kaga, Rujo, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Taiho, and the incomplete Unru. In 1943 alone, the United States produced more fleet carriers than Japan had built in 20 years. Shipyards in the U.S. operated at unprecedented levels of efficiency. Newport News Shipbuilding produced 7 Essex-class carriers, including the USS Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, and Randolph, each of them built in less than 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. The yard's workforce, which included thousands of women, maintained a pace of simultaneous construction of 3 carriers throughout 1943 and 1944. Bethlehem Steel's Four River Shipyard contributed 6 additional carriers, such as USS Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hancock, Shangri-La, and Lake Champlain. As the war progressed, production rates accelerated as shipbuilding techniques were refined. The Lake Champlain was completed in a record 14 months after the keel was laid, an extraordinary feat for a fleet carrier.
The U.S. Navy also pioneered modular construction methods at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Entire ship sections were prefabricated in advance of the keel laying, and this approach drastically reduced the time required for completion. For instance, USS Antietam and USS Boxer were both commissioned in just 15 and 16 months, respectively. These techniques would go on to influence naval shipbuilding for decades after the war. The success of the Essex-class carriers in combat was undeniable.
The USS Lexington, famously dubbed the Blue Ghost by Japanese propaganda, participated in nearly every major Pacific battle from Tarawa to the final assault on Japan. Despite multiple kamikaze attacks, the Lexington remained operational throughout the war, and it destroyed over 300 enemy aircraft in the process. The USS Enterprise, though a Yorktown-class carrier, also demonstrated the power of American carrier aviation. Its air group frequently worked alongside those of Essex-class ships, showcasing the remarkable interoperability and standardization within the American carrier fleet. This ability to seamlessly cross-deck aircraft and pilots between ships gave the U.S. Navy unparalleled operational flexibility. In contrast, the Japanese carriers were each unique, with different designs and equipment, which prevented them from achieving the same level of coordination. In response to America's carrier-building dominance, Japan made desperate efforts to close the gap. The Shinano was one such attempt. Originally planned as the third of Japan's massive Yamato-class battleships, Shinano was converted into an aircraft carrier after the setback at Midway. However, this conversion resulted in a compromised design. After only 10 days of service, she was sunk by a U.S. submarine. Additionally, Japan's Unru-class carrier program aimed to mass-produce carriers with simplified designs. Yet most of these ships remained incomplete or were canceled by the war's end. The few that were finished faced an insurmountable challenge: Japan's severe shortage of qualified carrier pilots. The Unru-class never saw action with a full air group, as there simply were not enough trained aviators to man them. The failure of the program underscored the essential truth: constructing carriers without a trained aircrew was futile. By January 4, 1945, the United States had achieved total domination in the Pacific. American carrier task forces, led by Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, could launch devastating airstrikes against Japan's home islands, including Tokyo. By contrast, Japan had no operational carriers, and fewer than 100 carrier-qualified pilots remained. The outcome of the war at sea had become a foregone conclusion.
The disparity in human cost between the two sides was equally telling. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the U.S. lost 123 aircraft and 109 men. In return, American forces destroyed nearly 600 enemy aircraft, sank 2 fleet carriers, a light carrier, and 2 oilers, and killed nearly 3,000 Japanese airmen and sailors. For comparison, each Essex-class carrier required about 3,000 crew members, and U.S. training programs were churning out 5,000 qualified carrier personnel every month by 1944. In contrast, Japan's training programs had effectively collapsed by late 1944, unable to produce the pilots necessary to fill their dwindling fleet. The war in the Pacific demonstrated the overwhelming importance of industrial output and the ability to rapidly produce, train, and sustain military forces. America's capacity for mass production, combined with its superior training systems, ensured its victory in the naval conflict. Meanwhile, Japan's industrial limitations and inability to produce trained personnel in sufficient numbers ensured its eventual defeat. The technological gap between the American and Japanese naval forces was nothing short of decisive. American aircraft carriers were equipped with advanced SK and SK-2 radar systems, capable of tracking incoming threats and directing fighter operations at ranges over 150 miles. Meanwhile, Japanese carriers relied on outdated visual observers and rudimentary radar with effective ranges of less than 50 miles. This disparity in technology was just one of many factors that made American carriers vastly superior in combat operations. The identification friend or foe system in American carriers was another key difference. This technology minimized the risk of friendly fire during large, chaotic air battles, allowing American forces to coordinate strikes with a level of precision unmatched by their Japanese counterparts. In contrast, Japanese carriers operated with manual systems, relying on voice tubes and physical plotting boards to track aircraft and enemy movements. American carriers like the Essex-class could launch full airstrikes, comprising up to 80 aircraft in under 45 minutes, thanks to efficient systems for preparing and deploying planes.
Meanwhile, Japanese carriers often took nearly 2 hours to execute similar operations, and their higher accident rates made their flight decks much less reliable. Even recovery operations were faster and safer aboard American ships, thanks to the landing signal officers, or LSO, and advanced arresting gear, which reduced the likelihood of accidents and allowed for rapid turnaround times. One of the most revolutionary advancements aboard American carriers was the Combat Information Center, or CIC. This central hub allowed real-time tracking of hundreds of aircraft, surface ships, and even submarine threats. With radio communication linking every aircraft, American carriers could coordinate efforts between multiple task groups with efficiency and accuracy. On the other hand, Japanese carriers struggled with limited communication systems, relying on voice tubes and manual plotting to track aircraft and enemy movements.
Even in terms of fuel systems, American carriers had an edge. American ships used sealed fuel systems with CO2 purging, reducing the risk of catastrophic explosions. In contrast, the Japanese carriers, including the newly built Taiho, were vulnerable to single torpedo hits as their aviation fuel vapors were not adequately contained. These explosions led to the loss of several Japanese carriers during critical moments in the war. The kamikaze attacks, which began in October 1944, marked Japan's recognition of their conventional defeat. With their carriers overwhelmed by American fighters and anti-aircraft defenses, Japanese pilots resorted to suicide missions in a desperate attempt to inflict damage. However, even these extreme measures had limited success against American carriers, particularly the Essex-class ships, which were equipped with armored flight decks and had far superior damage control systems. For instance, the USS Intrepid endured 5 kamikaze strikes, yet each time it returned to service. Similarly, the USS Ticonderoga took 2 kamikaze hits, killing 144 crew members, but the ship remained operational. The USS Essex herself survived a kamikaze attack on November 25, 1944, which killed 15 men but caused minimal structural damage. The USS Bunker Hill, after being hit by 2 kamikazes within 30 seconds on May 11, 1945, sustained massive fires and the loss of 389 men. Yet despite such devastating damage, she sailed to safety for repairs, a testament to the superior training and damage control capabilities aboard the Essex-class carriers. By March 1945, the USS Bonhomme Richard became the 14th Essex-class carrier to enter combat, marking a significant milestone. At this point, the United States had more than 100 aircraft carriers in operation across the Pacific theater, including escort carriers and light carriers. In stark contrast, Japan had no operational carriers and fewer than 5,000 aircraft left in the home islands. The imbalance in naval power was absolute. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz analyzed the situation in a report to Admiral Ernest King. He praised the Essex-class program, stating that the U.S. had not only gained ships but had achieved a systematic superiority that the Japanese could not hope to match. He acknowledged that each new carrier represented the full strength of American industrial power, advanced training systems, and technological superiority, all of which were beyond Japan's capacity to replicate. Even as victory seemed assured, the American production lines never slowed. The USS Shangri-La was commissioned on September 15, 1944. The USS Lake Champlain followed on June 3, 1945, and the USS Tarawa on December 8, 1945. This continuous momentum reflected not just the final stages of the war, but American planners' foresight into future conflicts.
Throughout the war, Essex-class carriers played pivotal roles in every major amphibious operation. From the early raids in the Central Pacific to the invasion of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, the carriers provided essential air support for American ground forces. The battle for Iwo Jima demonstrated the incredible operational tempo of the American carriers. 15 carriers launched 470 fighter sweeps, conducted 220 bombing strikes, and maintained continuous combat air patrols for 19 days.
Even with significant combat losses, aircraft availability rates remained above 80%, a testament to the efficiency of American logistics and industrial capabilities. By the end of the Pacific War, Japanese land-based aviation was effectively eliminated as a viable threat, and the Essex-class carriers had played an irreplaceable role in ensuring the success of American operations across the Pacific. By October 1944, the U.S. Navy's carrier force had grown into a formidable and highly efficient combat unit. In the Philippines, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, 17 fast carriers operated across 4 distinct task groups, showcasing the American ability to project air power at an unprecedented scale. On October 24, 1944, American carriers launched more than 1,400 sorties in a single day, inflicting massive damage on the Japanese fleet. The following day, American aircraft executed a devastating air assault, resulting in the sinking of the super battleship Musashi, an example of overwhelming air superiority that no vessel could withstand. Among the pilots leading these attacks was Commander David McCampbell of Air Group 15, stationed aboard the USS Essex. McCampbell's feats exemplified the exceptional skill and efficiency of American carrier aviation. On June 19, 1944, during the infamous Marianas Turkey Shoot, McCampbell shot down 5 Japanese dive bombers in a single mission, earning the title of Ace in a Day. Later that same day, he downed 2 more Zeros over Guam. Then, on October 24, 1944, at the start of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, McCampbell made history again by becoming the only American airman to achieve Ace-in-a-Day status twice, shooting down 9 enemy aircraft in a single sortie. McCampbell's squadron, Air Group 15, became known as the Fabled 15 due to its incredible success. Over the course of 6 months of combat operations, this group destroyed 315 enemy aircraft in the air and an additional 348 on the ground. Furthermore, their strikes sank 296,500 tons of Japanese shipping, including 1 battleship, 3 aircraft carriers, 9 cruisers, and 19 destroyers. Their performance set a high standard for American carrier aviation during the Pacific War. A key factor behind the success was the superior training and experience of American pilots compared to their Japanese counterparts. While American carrier air groups required approximately 350 pilots and aircrew per unit, U.S. training programs were producing 2,000 fully qualified naval aviators per month by 1944. In contrast, Japanese training programs had collapsed by this time, producing fewer than 100 pilots per month, often undertrained and inexperienced.
This disparity in training was reflected in the operational losses experienced by each side. American carrier air groups suffered an average operational loss rate of only 2% per month due to accidents. In comparison, Japanese units, composed mostly of inexperienced pilots, endured a staggering 10% monthly attrition rate. The results in combat were equally lopsided. By 1945, American combat losses were consistently below 10% of Japanese losses, marking a decisive advantage for the U.S. Navy. Aircraft production further demonstrated the overwhelming American advantage. Between 1943 and 1945, the Grumman Corporation delivered 12,275 F-6F Hellcats, while Curtiss-Wright produced 7,140 SB-2C Helldivers, and General Motors Eastern Aircraft Division manufactured 9,839 TBM Avengers. By 1944, the U.S. production rate for carrier aircraft far exceeded Japan's annual output, further cementing the United States' air superiority in the Pacific. The logistical infrastructure supporting these operations was equally impressive. U.S. Navy supply chains, including fleet oilers, ammunition ships, and other support vessels, enabled the fast carriers to remain operational for extended periods at sea. Techniques like underway replenishment, perfected during the war, allowed for the continuous resupply of aircraft carriers while they remained in active combat zones. In contrast, Japanese carriers dependent on port visits for basic supplies lacked the operational flexibility of their American counterparts. The capabilities of the Essex-class carriers became especially evident during the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945. American carriers launched strikes against the Japanese defenses for 72 consecutive hours in preparation for the invasion, then continued to provide close air support for 36 days. Aircraft from the USS Essex alone flew 1,418 combat sorties, delivering 156 tons of bombs and firing 141 rockets. No Japanese carrier force could have sustained such an operational tempo, as their logistical challenges and resource limitations hindered their ability to perform at such a level. By April 1945, as the U.S. prepared for the invasion of Okinawa, the disparity between American and Japanese naval capabilities had become overwhelming. Task Force 58, which supported the invasion, operated 18 fast carriers, including 14 Essex-class ships, and was bolstered by both Essex-class fleet carriers and Independence-class light carriers. With a combined air group of over 1,400 aircraft and ample supplies of replacement aircraft and pilots, American forces were poised to dominate the skies. In contrast, the Japanese assembled a force of only 1,900 aircraft for their desperate kamikaze attacks, most of which were flown by inexperienced pilots with fewer than 30 hours of flight time. The Okinawa campaign, which lasted for 82 days, was a testament to the superiority of American naval power. Despite the relentless onslaught of nearly 1,900 kamikaze sorties, the Essex-class carriers maintained continuous operations, launching airstrikes and providing close air support throughout the battle. American pilots, trained and experienced, delivered a punishing blow to the Japanese forces, demonstrating once again the clear advantage held by U.S. carrier aviation, both in combat effectiveness and operational sustainability.
During the Pacific War's final stages, the durability of American carriers became a defining feature of the conflict. USS Bunker Hill, Enterprise, and Randolph all survived multiple kamikaze attacks and continued to carry out operations effectively. Despite the relentless nature of these suicide strikes, the Japanese failed to make a significant impact on the American carriers thanks to their superior armor and damage control measures. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese had exhausted nearly all their remaining air power. The American carriers, now almost unopposed, launched repeated strikes across Japan with devastating results. On July 10, 1945, Task Force 38 conducted a massive airstrike, launching 1,022 sorties against Tokyo, more aircraft than Japan had available within its entire home islands. American pilots flew high-performance aircraft that easily outclassed the Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, which proved ineffective in the face of such superior technology and tactics. The war would not reach the planned Operation Olympic, the invasion of Japan, which was set to demonstrate the ultimate concentration of American carrier strength. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rendered such an operation unnecessary, abruptly ending the conflict before the planned invasion could take place. The superiority of the Essex-class carriers. The Royal Navy's experience in the Pacific theater further highlighted the overwhelming advantage of the Essex-class carriers. When operating alongside these American ships, British carriers, despite their own strong armored flight decks, struggled to maintain the operational tempo set by the American fleet. For instance, the British aircraft carrier HMS Formidable could only operate 36 aircraft, while an Essex-class carrier typically operated over 90. Even with their smaller air groups, the British were forced to recognize the sheer scale of American operational capacity, and over time, they adopted many of the damage control techniques used by the U.S. Navy. Post-war analyses further solidified the Essex-class carrier's dominance in terms of survivability. Despite suffering numerous attacks, including kamikaze attacks, conventional bombings, and torpedo hits, none of the Essex-class carriers were lost to enemy action during World War II. In contrast, Japan's carrier fleet experienced nearly 100% loss rates. The difference in survivability was not mere luck, but the result of superior design and the exceptional damage control capabilities of the American fleet.
Admiral Raymond Spruance,
reflecting on the success of the Essex-class carrier program, emphasized its transformative impact on the United States Navy. He remarked that the real strength of the Essex-class carriers was not in any single vessel's abilities, but in the systematized production that allowed the U.S. to flood the Pacific with carriers. In 1943, we built more carriers than Japan managed to commission in 20 years, he noted, underscoring the decisive role of industrial capacity in determining the outcome of the war. Lasting impact beyond World War II. The legacy of the Essex-class carriers extended far beyond World War II. These ships served in various capacities throughout the Cold War and beyond, remaining active during the Korean War, Vietnam War, and even into the 1990s as training vessels. The USS Lexington, the final operational Essex-class carrier, was not decommissioned until 1991, after 48 years of service. The design and production methods developed for these ships would go on to influence the design of every subsequent American carrier, shaping naval aviation for decades. The impact of these carriers on shipbuilding techniques was profound, as their mass production revolutionized the construction of warships worldwide. By the end of World War II, 24 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned and 14 of them saw combat. These carriers played a critical role in the Pacific War, with air groups from them destroying over 5,000 Japanese aircraft and sinking 200,000 tons of enemy warships. The Japanese carrier aviation, which had begun the war with great success at Pearl Harbor, was effectively neutralized by the overwhelming industrial power of the United States. The fall of Japan's naval power. Captain Arleigh Burke, who would later become Chief of Naval Operations, had a sharp assessment of the role the Essex-class carriers played in Japan's defeat. Reflecting on the war, Burke observed, "The Japanese started this war with the best carrier pilots in the world. We ended it with the only carrier pilots in the world." His comment pointed to the sheer numbers and design superiority of the Essex-class carriers, which made Japan's efforts to match the American fleet utterly futile. "We didn't just defeat them, we overwhelmed them." The industrial mobilization behind Essex-class carrier production. The true scale of American industrial achievement during World War II was revealed through statistics on the production of the Essex-class carriers. At Newport News Shipbuilding, the workforce grew dramatically, from 11,000 employees in 1941 to 31,000 in 1943, as the shipyard worked around the clock, with 3 shifts maintaining constant production. Women, who had been recruited into the workforce in large numbers during the war, made up 20% of the workforce by 1944, contributing significantly to the rapid construction of warships. In total, the United States built 24 Essex-class carriers during the war. These ships became the backbone of the Pacific Fleet, and their unmatched production rate was a key factor in ensuring American victory. While Japan has struggled to replace its carriers, the U.S. Navy was able to produce them in large quantities, ensuring that American forces maintained superiority in the skies and at sea. The defeat of Japan's carrier fleet. In the final tally, the American Essex-class carriers destroyed over 5,000 Japanese aircraft and sank an impressive 200,000 tons of enemy warships. The difference in industrial output between the two nations was overwhelming. The American fleet could replace its losses far more rapidly than Japan could, and with each passing battle, it became increasingly clear that the war was being decided not by individual ship superiority, but by the sheer industrial might of the United States. The Japanese carrier aviation, which had initially inflicted devastating losses on the American fleet during the attack on Pearl Harbor, was effectively wiped out by American industrial production. By the time of the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the following carrier raids, Japan's naval air forces had been reduced to ineffective, under-trained pilots flying suicidal missions. The American fleet, with its ever-expanding number of Essex-class carriers and highly trained air groups, had proven itself capable of maintaining continuous operations, defeating the once formidable Japanese naval power through the sheer weight of its production and superior design. The scale and efficiency of American aircraft carrier production during World War II were unmatched, a feat that directly contributed to the Allied victory in the Pacific. Each Essex-class carrier required vast resources: 55,000 tons of steel, 1,000 miles of electrical wiring, and 250,000 man-hours of labor. While the Japanese struggled to build even a single carrier within a reasonable time frame, American shipyards were simultaneously constructing multiple hulls. This immense production capability allowed the U.S. Navy to outpace Japan not only in numbers, but in technology and training as well. From 1932 to 1941, Japan had passed several bills aimed at encouraging the construction of merchant vessels with military capabilities. However, these efforts were insufficient when compared to the highly specialized purpose-built carriers produced by the United States. By contrast, the U.S. Navy's technological advancements in shipbuilding ensured that each Essex-class carrier was more advanced and effective than the previous. The American shipbuilding industry embraced welding techniques, which replaced the older riveting methods, reducing construction time by 30%. Modular assembly allowed for parallel construction of key sections, speeding up the overall production rate. One of the key features of American carrier design was the armored flight deck, which was reinforced to withstand bomb penetration. Ventilation systems were improved to prevent the accumulation of dangerous aviation fuel vapors, and elevators were redesigned to allow for aircraft movement without halting flight operations. These innovations significantly enhanced the effectiveness and safety of the carriers, providing crucial advantages in combat.
The importance of training and operational coordination also became evident. American carriers had integrated systems that coordinated their defenses. Fighter directors aboard the carriers worked in tandem with pilots in the air, creating a seamless defense system that made American carriers nearly impenetrable. In contrast, Japanese carriers lacked such coordinated systems, relying instead on individual pilot initiative, which was not sufficient to fend off the American onslaught. Furthermore, American carriers prioritized damage control and firefighting capabilities. Every crew member was trained in damage control, and specialized firefighting schools taught techniques that saved several carriers from total destruction. Medical facilities aboard each carrier included operating theaters and 60-bed sick bays. Japanese carriers, however, had minimal medical facilities and limited damage control training, which proved disastrous during critical moments in battle. The Essex-class program had far-reaching effects beyond military operations. The shipbuilding effort injected large sums of money into the American economy, with shipyard workers earning unprecedented wages that contributed to consumer spending. The shipyard towns flourished as a result of the Essex-class program, demonstrating that democratic mobilization could produce faster and more efficiently than totalitarian regimes. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Essex-class had set an extraordinary precedent. A single class of ship had, in a very real sense, determined the outcome of the largest naval conflict ever fought. It wasn't just the excellence of the individual vessels that made them successful, but rather the systematic superiority in their production, training, and operational capabilities that left no room for Japanese competition. As Vice Admiral John McCain of Task Force 38, who led American carriers at the war's end, put it, the Essex-class carrier was not just a ship, it was a weapons system, a complete system that included the vessel, the air group, the training establishment, the supply chain, and the industrial base that produced them faster than the enemy could sink them. That's not fighting fair, that's fighting to win. The numbers tell a clear story of overwhelming industrial and operational superiority. From the laying down of the first USS Essex in April 1941 to Japan's surrender in August 1945,
American shipyards produced a formidable fleet of 24 carriers of the same design, each capable of operating up to 2,000 aircraft. There were 30,000 trained personnel dedicated to keeping these carriers running at peak efficiency. The victory of the U.S. Navy was made possible not just by technological superiority, but by sheer industrial capacity. Meanwhile, the wrecks of Japanese carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu at Midway, Shoho in the Coral Sea, Shokaku and Taiho in the Philippine Sea, Zuikaku, Chiodos, Chiyoda, and Zuho at Leyte Gulf. These ships and their crews are remembered for their courage fighting against overwhelming odds, but their sacrifice marked the end of an era where individual skill and bravery could overcome industrial disadvantage. Japan's naval strategy, built on tradition and individual valor, ultimately could not withstand the onslaught of American production and technological advancement. In his final report to the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, Admiral Chester Nimitz concluded, "The Essex-class carrier program represents the greatest concentration of naval air power ever achieved. These ships and their crews have demonstrated that American industrial might, combined with superior training and technology, creates a combat capability that no enemy can match." The Essex-class didn't just win the Pacific War, they made it impossible for Japan to win. The revolution in naval warfare brought about by the Essex-class carriers was profound. Battleships, once considered the cornerstone of naval power, were relegated to support roles like shore bombardment and anti-aircraft defense. In their place, the aircraft carrier, perfected by the Essex design, became the capital ship of modern navies. The Essex-class carriers proved that in modern warfare, victory is determined by the combination of industrial output and technological innovation. The success of the U.S. Navy highlighted the unmatched power of democratic mobilization, showing that nations that can harness the full force of their industrial capacity can achieve victory on an unprecedented scale. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, where distances were measured in thousands of miles and decisive battles were fought by aircraft launched from mobile platforms, the Essex-class carriers demonstrated that when quantity is matched with quality, absolute victory is not only possible, it is inevitable.